Hello, welcome to episode 7 of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Marc Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
And in this episode, we're going to be discussing the 1987 film, The Lost Boys. And just a little heads up, get you prepared. We're going to be doing our first holiday-themed episode. We're going to be covering Gremlins. We're going to get that out to you before Christmas, which means you're going to have to see Gremlins before Christmas.
Yeah, definitely check it out. Well, personal note, that movie is how I learned there was no Santa Claus.
Oh, brutal.
Yeah.
So many layers of sadness.
Yeah.
But let's talk about spoilers for this episode.
Sure. You should have seen Lost Boys by now. If you haven't seen it, what are you doing? If you're a horror fan and you haven't seen Lost Boys, unless you're 20 years old or younger, there is just no excuse for it.
We don't want your listenership.
Yeah, just kick rocks. If you haven't already, please go over to iTunes and give us a rating and a review. It helps us go up in the rankings on iTunes, which I've been told is a great thing, and it'll help people find our podcast and listen to it and hopefully enjoy it as much as you do. Also, if you're into inspirational messaging and horrific images, go check us out on Instagram at scarythoughts.podcast. Post pretty much every day something that will inspire you and perhaps frighten you. And also, we have our very first sponsor. Did we already do the album thing? Yeah, we all have our very first sponsor. Very exciting. And our first sponsor is Marc.
Hi. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
It's phenomenal.
I just put out a new album last week called 00. It's under my own name. And it is available on my label, but via marckate.com, marckate.com.
If there was an activity that one should do while listening to your album, what should it be?
Weep.
That's excellent.
Let's talk about The Lost Boys.
Sure. So I saw this movie when it came out on video, when it came out on video, not when it came out. So probably a year or two after it came out. And it was immediately my favorite vampire movie I had ever seen. And I don't know. Well, how did you first see it?
I saw it in the theater. Oh. Yeah, it left a pretty huge impression on me. I think that because it is so 80s, so very 80s, it's somewhere between defined a lot of 80s aesthetics and was sort of fashion victim to a lot of 80s aesthetics. Mm-hmm. I think it at first aged very poorly. So I really feel like when I first saw it, I was super into it, but then its sort of cheesy fashion and out of dateness really hit hard, and I just did not think about it again for decades. But getting to rewatch it again for this podcast it was really fun. Like, it's such a strong, weird movie. So many bizarre choices. All the character actors in it are all just really nailing it hard.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think, definitely at the time, 1987 is like the height of hair rock and stuff like that. Yeah. And you really feel like the costuming was for sure inspired by that in a certain way. And I think you really, like, one of the biggest things to talk about in this movie is the look of it and how the characters look, and how especially the vampires look, because it really deviated a lot from what had gone before. And what's interesting watching it now is that 80s fashion wasn't exactly on the street so much. So now you see it when you look at movies that take place in the 80s, like, for instance, Stranger Things rather. I always do that. Like, when you see a movie that takes place in the 80s, no one ever looks like this. So it gives the film a bit of like a weird dreaminess, which I think is actually even more effective now than it would have been back then. Like, the town of Santa Carla, when they enter it for the first time, they look back to the sign and it says murder capital of the world. It definitely feels like a demarcated moment. And they're entering into this weird dream world. And especially with the opening scene, the aerial photographs, somebody must have owned a helicopter. Like, one of the producers must have owned a helicopter company and was just backdooring money into his pocket. That's the only way to explain it. But that, coupled with the carnival atmosphere of the Santa Cruz Boardwalk and the opening scene on the carousel, it just immediately puts you in this spinning, dreamy space, which I think is very effective for the movie itself.
Absolutely. There's no way you would see The Lost Boys not knowing it is some kind of a horror film. Mm-hmm. And right from the outset, you kind of get this dread. It's like this fun place and there are all these people partying and out in the sunshine, but you know that this town is fucked somehow. Mm-hmm. Something about the aesthetic of it that really struck me is that they're vampires, so there's a sort of gothicness, but because they're these like motorcycle rock and rollers,
Right.
It sort of really reminded me of what happened with the band The Cult, where they were Southern Death Cult, and they were sort of like an English death rock band, and they were super goth, and then they went electric with their albums Electric and Sonic Temple, and their hair got really big, and I feel like the Lost Boys aesthetic is really drawn from that crossover of where goth bands started getting hair metal, and I think the sort of final toll of it is that if you go to, say, Melrose now and you wanted to spend like $3,000 on a jacket, it's pretty much what the Lost Boys are wearing. Like that's still the like I'm a rocker look. It's that sort of like drum major goth biker jacket.
Yeah, I don't know if this is an offensive term, but the word gypsy gets thrown around quite a bit.
Totally. And
I know that there's probably, there's the whole thing like, oh, we're travelers. I'm aware of that. I learned it on the internet recently when I was researching for this movie. But I think we all know what we mean when I say they look like gypsies, right? Like they have this kind of like weird, you can almost imagine like a fortune teller playing a violin in the background or something like that. So you have that going on. And then you have them very counter to what you expect of a beach culture, right? One of the things that's so interesting about this film is it's a beach town. And if you've ever been to Santa Cruz, there are elements of the kind of like street punk thing that's shown in the very first part of the film that's still sort of present in Santa Cruz, but it's more than anything, it's a beach town, right? And then it's like these guys on their motorcycles, it's almost like they're violating the beach itself. They're violating the rules of the beach. They're obviously now out during the day. They're not dressed for swimming, and their motorcycles literally tear down the beachfront, through other people partying. It's very like invasive to the idea of like a beach movie.
Totally, and invasive to the hippie thing, which is very present. Grandpa is clearly some form of West Coast hippie. Ma and Pa Frog are like these passed out hippies in the corner. It's definitely, these bad kids. And, and then the Frog Brothers are there to defend, to defend that turf. Yeah.
And the transition too really reminds me of sometimes you pick up things that are attitudes. You don't really realize where you get them personally. And I think about this movie, when I saw it, I wanted to be the Frog Brothers. I mean, that was all, I was like, man, these guys are fucking awesome. And part of that is like, I had just seen Goonies and Corey Feldman is the shit in Goonies. And then you sort of like, give him a little bit of that credibility from Goonies, and they're basically like really bad action heroes.
Yes.
I read that when Corey Feldman and the other guy whose name I'll never remember were auditioning for the role, and when they got the role, they basically said, go watch every Chuck Norris movie, and then that was like their preparation for this film. And there's something kind of awesome about that.
Yeah.
But the hippie thing is an interesting thing because they're almost like sort of like a Reaganite, not, I won't even say post-punk. Like they're almost like today they would be like anarchist libertarians or something like that. The Frog Brothers.
Well, I mean, I think this movie really takes a lot of, so there's always this always, it's not the most common discussion, but this sort of like zombies versus vampires, Republicans versus Democrats, and tracking when those films are popular versus who's in office.
Right.
And it kind of falls apart if you look at it too closely, but there's a way in which those two tensions do sort of hold a magnifying glass up to some sort of political realities. But what I think is interesting about The Lost Boys is that the fear of vampires politically is that they are decadent and libidinal and don't follow tradition. But what we have in this film are these vampires who are sort of like living lawlessly. And the Frog Brothers are sort of, yes, the right-wing action hero in a certain sense. But the vampires are sort of like this balance between like libertarian and libertine,
Yeah, I mean, more than the word that just pops into mind for these vampires is decadent.
Absolutely.
Just decadent. They live in this abandoned hotel that has fallen down the cliff, and it's full of tapestries and candles and bottles of blood wine and a giant Jim Morrison poster. And it really, in some ways, they embodied the 60s that the older characters in the film are actually from, but they're almost like the 1969 Charles Manson 60s.
Right.
Like they're like post Altamont hippies, you know, especially with the motorcycles and things like that. And then, you know, you think about the characters who are hippies in the movie, they're very kind. Like the grandfather's pretty kind. He has a pretty funny sense of humor. And the mom has this really great line where when she's talking to Max and he's just thrown the gang out of his store, and she's very generous and says, oh, you know, we were like them once, except for they dress better, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing. I was like, man, how did they dress if these dudes are dressed better? But then, you know, that's the thing. I think about that today. I looked at one of those BuzzFeed articles, and it was like ravers then versus ravers now. And I was like, man, they're way hotter now, showing more skin. They have access to P90X or something, or what, you know, just people just, you know, the styles evolve and sharpen and change. And it's very interesting that they went with this sort of like street culture look for their vampires, which is before vampires were aristocratic, and you'd see them in suits like Hunger or in robes and like old timey outfits like in Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Well, and also Dracula included, vampires are always this parasite in a certain way.
Sure.
And the parasite is always a foreigner, especially with Dracula, but almost always it is basically this interloper comes to town and starts consuming the locals. But in this, and you know, they're like very sophisticated and seductive and show up and start seducing the locals. But in this film, this family comes to town and they're the interlopers. They just got there. Santa Carla is run by the vampires. Michael and Sam, they just got there. So it kind of flips that.
Yeah. You know, I'd like to...
They're decadent from Phoenix.
Yeah, that was actually what I wanted to talk about next. I was glad you brought up, is clearly... Okay, look, I love the Frog Brothers. Clearly the best character in this film is Sam.
Sam is fascinating.
It's such a weird character, especially when you look back at him. And there's moments in the film where he is attempting, or maybe sees himself as more sophisticated than everybody else. Like he comes into the comic book shop
like he owns the place.
Talking like he owns Batman number 14. You know, totally weird. And he just shits all over their Dewey Decimal System of the comic books. And you know, like one of the things about the Frog Brothers and those type of dudes is they're truth, justice, in the American way. They're all about order. And here comes this dude coming in saying, look, there's an even higher order than what you have going on here. And I'm privy to it because I'm from Phoenix. And it's just so weird. And I remember when I saw that movie, I was so young, I knew there was a Phoenix, but I didn't know anything about it.
Have you been there?
Yeah, I've been there. And
it's awful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say it's awful in case there's some listeners there.
I'm sorry, listeners. You gotta move.
Get out.
You can't afford San Francisco, but you should really come over here.
No. If you're listening to us, clearly you're a weirdo. Go down and join Doug Stanhope in his compound in Bisbee, Arizona. That's the move. San Francisco, it's over. It's terrible. It's overrun. This city is only for homeless people and the super rich. Anybody in between, it's fucked. Stay away. Like if I could put a big zombie style dead here, don't enter on the entire city, I would.
Just do the Negan, just tie body parts to the statues at the gates.
Yeah. But yeah, so talking about Sam, you know, like his costuming is as garish as the vampires is in a totally different way. I mean, there's moments when his outfits when I was a little kid didn't make any sense to me at all. It just didn't. It seemed like a crazy wild thing. And now you get a little bit of, like, it reminds me a little bit of the stuff that Keith Haring used to wear.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like the weird bright prints and things like that. And then there's moments when characters even try to bag on his style. Like one of the Frog Brothers says, what are you, a fashion victim or something like that? Yeah. And then he's like, yeah, it's pretty cool, right? And he's just no care in the world. He's just so confident.
Yeah.
And he figures out that his brother's a vampire, like, instantly. You know, he reads the comic book. He's explicitly not into horror comics, and he reads it. And he's not buying it, right? He's skeptical. He's like, why are these weirdos even suggesting that this is going to save my life? But he puts it together so quick and is just ready to accept it and has a plan. And then later on, he actually identifies the head vampire before anybody else does. And he's right. You know, he doesn't have all the information, though, which is, you know, he doesn't understand the point about him being invited in. And that negates all the traditional vampire rules, which I don't know if you're game for it, but I'd love to move us into our usual segment of rules of engagement, because I think that the way these vampires function is important to how this story is told.
I do, but first, a couple of things about Sam that I think are interesting. Well, you know, I find it hard to not think of him as the protagonist of this movie, actually. The number of times that someone says Michael in this film is so laughably frequent that there's actually a super cut of that on YouTube.
I saw it the other day. It's great.
It's great. And it really is. They just say his name too many damn times.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Jason Patric is a really flat actor. I think he totally works in this part.
Sure.
But he does not consume the screen and the action. He's sort of a very mute character.
Yeah.
Sam is totally engaged. He moves the plot, actively moves the plot forward.
Absolutely.
He's not the victim of circumstances. Like, Jason's just a fucking puppet.
Right.
Of David, of Star. Whereas Sam is, he might even have as much screen time as Patrick. But something else. Okay. There is far too much time and energy spent on the Sam is actually gay theory, which is, we could say not a theory. It's just like, yeah, he's on his way to being gay as soon as he hits puberty.
Yeah. Well, you know, like, where's the evidence, really? Like, there's the Rob Lowe poster on the wall, which is definitely questionable.
Yes.
There's some people have pointed out the singing "I Ain't Got a Man" in the bathtub.
Yep.
And maybe he likes 50s music. And, you know, one thing I was thinking about over the weekend when I watched this again was, like, you get the feeling that Sam really would appreciate camp if he was aware of what it is. You know, he's really into 50s music. His room is full of all kinds of regalia. He sort of really appreciates his grandfather's weirdness. Like, he really appreciates it. You know, he has a love for his old car. I mean, you can almost imagine Sam being like a John Waters fan.
Sure.
Yeah.
He also, you know, winces at when Star first appears. He's totally enthralled by the greased up saxophone performance of Timmy Capello. Quick side note, I actually saw Timmy Capello play live. He played keyboards and sax for Tina Turner. I saw them at the Oakland Coliseum in '88 or something. It was bonkers to have them sharing a stage. Anyway, but here's something that I noticed that I didn't see anybody mention, and this is just like a total reach. But Diane Wiest, at the beginning, you know that she like left her relationship fast. She didn't want to argue it out in court.
Right.
She just left without a fight. And there's this thing about the problem with your dad is he didn't believe in the closet monster. And I wonder, I'm totally stretching, their dad was a homophobic asshole. And she's protecting, the whole move is, and divorce is protecting Sam from their homophobic father. She just got out of town just to protect him because she didn't want this monster of a father hurting their son.
Yeah, it's definitely a stretch.
But the text is there. It's like there's nothing contrary to that. So I'm just gonna enjoy that.
Yeah. She left the major metropolis of Phoenix, Arizona, in order to expose her gay son to the real world of magical California. I think it works. I do agree. I mean, it's not what I would have picked up, but I've certainly
Dad didn't believe in the closet monster. I just couldn't let that one go.
Yeah. But he could sleep with the closet door open, so maybe he's open to it. Yeah, I don't know. But I for sure agree with you that Sam is the protagonist of this film and definitely the more interesting of the two brothers. Because the brother, Michael, he's really like a kind of a basic bitch. You know, he goes and puts on his Jim Morrison leather jacket. He gets his ear pierced like everybody else does. And he really falls in.
He pulls a total Sandra Dee at the end of Grease.
Yes.
He's like, oh, she's hot. I'm going to go get a leather jacket and get my ear pierced. And she appears that second.
Right.
He's just like, he basically sees her. They don't exchange words, but he decides to go get a leather jacket to like lure her further in, and she just manifests.
Yeah, it's like he goes full Fonzie and then is completely enraptured with this world. And the thing about it is very alluring. You know, the idea of being immortal and riding motorcycles on the beach and just laying waste to anything you want is totally appealing.
Well, that's why vampires are awesome.
Yeah.
Let's speak about rules of engagement. How did you want to approach?
Let's just talk about what's different about these vampires, like what was new at the time.
Well, one thing that I was really into, there are a lot of new vampire things that this movie introduced, but one thing is vampire seduction as teen peer pressure. And that was, I can't think of anything else. Like the vampire is the seducer and pressuring someone with mind control,
right,
as being analogous to peer pressure.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think definitely there's a pecking order group dynamic kind of going on. And then I think of these characters almost as like feral wolves. You know, they hunt in a pack.
Yes.
There's an alpha in the pack. Yep. I mean, you even have Thorn is literally a wolf. You know, that's right. You know, so you have the Hound of Hell. That's kind of a classic vampire thing.
Oh yeah.
The slight change to the facial features and the weird eyes, that may have popped up a little bit earlier in other films or in comic books and such, but this was really the first time you ever see somebody like vamping out, and even the term vamping out goes on and it gets picked up by Buffy. Yay. The idea that there's a master vampire and that killing the master vampire will release all the vampires who've simply drank blood and have not killed anybody. I can't think of anywhere that appears other than Near Dark, which came out the same year as this film.
Yeah.
So I have to wonder.
There are a lot of parallels between those two movies.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to wonder if, one writer on one got fired and moved on or something like that. Because the idea of a mobile vagabond pack of vampires with similar rules.
And a kid and one female. And it's sort of like one is from the South and one is from a beach town. And otherwise they're almost the same movie.
Yeah, the best line in Near Dark is when they're talking about whether or not somebody fought in the war. And he's like, yeah, I fought in the war. And he's like, well, which one? He's like, this is not the one where the South lost. And it's such like a shithead move in the thing. He's basically like, okay, this is an undead Confederate soldier. But it's such a clever way of giving the character time. You know, and he's not explicit, but it's
my favorite kind of exposition.
Yeah, it's just great. Spoiler alert, Near Dark. Sorry.
It also I wouldn't say introduced, because I think this movie came out after Martin, but vampirism as addiction.
Right.
That's been explored before, and I feel like it's inherent to it in a way. But the way he is clearly like jonesing.
Right.
And the way, like, he's got to wear sunglasses during the day and everybody thinks he's on drugs.
Right.
It's not just about him manifesting these signals that he is coming down off drugs. He actually is kind of in the thralls of addiction.
Right.
That is actually what is happening to him.
Yeah. Another interesting thing that these vampires do is, I know that vampires have flown before because there's the bat, but they haven't like Supermaned around like they do in this film, to my knowledge, in earlier things. Like they would fly and show up in somebody's window.
Right.
But these people...
they would float.
Yeah, they would float or, hover off the ground or something like that. But these guys are going like full dream style flying around.
They can fly so hard and fast they can rip the roof off of a car.
Right. And one of the things I really love is how, as he's starting to become more of a vampire, his flight is very awkward. Like he's floating up and he doesn't understand it.
Hasn't figured it out.
And
totally.
Obviously the Lost Boys, it's from Peter Pan, right? And then in various versions of Peter Pan, there's a similar awkwardness when they start learning how to fly around. And I thought that was kind of a neat sort of childhood nod to the idea of Peter Pan in this film. Yeah.
Another element of vampirism in this film that actually bothers me, it's sort of like, despite the fact that like I've been obsessed with vampire films for maybe decades now.
Sure.
I sort of feel like if it's still based in Christian mythology after a certain point, I feel weird about it. Let me rephrase that. Vampirism is so tied to Christianity. It's always like the cross and holy water and things like that. And I always find it weird when vampire films after a certain point, after the 60s or 70s, after these cultural revolutions have really taken hold and Christianity really stopped keeping such a hold on pop culture and on the popular consciousness, that crosses and holy water still maintain, because in the reality, in the world building that is happening in The Lost Boys, that means that baby Jesus is true and righteous and the way, and holds power over evil. That there is evil, vampires are evil, and there is good, and that is Jesus died on the cross for your sins, and a priest who blessed some water to admit. Anyway. I just found that for me in this film is an odd sort of detour that, Christianity is real in this film.
Well, they're classic vampire stuff, and you never know, like, it appears like garlic just doesn't work, basically, right? And then crosses don't seem to work either, right? Like, because I think at one point, don't they like show a cross to somebody and the guy's like, ha ha ha, and he shakes it off, but the holy water for sure works, which is super weird.
Pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like vampire napalm, and that I think that having the holy water and the water guns is such a cool like detail for
good
the
job,
movie.
guys.
Like really totally effective, super interesting, and I have to imagine it probably comes from an early version of the script where the Frog Brothers were actually the stars of the film in the very beginning. Stages of the script development, and they were 8 years old and they were Boy Scouts. So you get probably would have been a bunch of Goonies style pranks, like almost Home Alone versus the Undead or something like that, which probably could have been an okay movie. I would love to keep talking about the Christianity element, because I just read a book called Pagan Christianity, and it's written by a guy who's kind of attached to what some people call like the home church movement. So the idea is that everything that we see in churches is pagan, right? And everything from crosses to all these different symbols, and that basically just sitting around in your home and talking to your congregation is kind of like natural Christianity as described in the Bible, like small meetings, here's the blood, here's the bread, be nice to each other, check you later. And so you wonder, like in the vampire mythology, is there something to all this stuff that just touches an older curse? Like how far back does vampirism go? But the whole idea of it being tied to Christianity, I mean, all the best vampire stories seem to be, like Dracula, like curses God, and Bram Stoker's Dracula and drives a knife in the cross, and then the blood spills out, and then he drinks the blood, which is crazy to me that anybody would be like, yes, this is exactly what you should be doing right now. I mean, who does that? It's just weird. Interestingly enough, have you heard anything about the new Anne Rice novel, the new vampire novel?
No.
So she had a break with Catholicism. She got super deep into it, wrote a bunch of Jesus novels, kind of put the vampire thing on the shelf, became completely disillusioned with the church. And I don't know that she's an atheist, but her newest novel, this is sort of a spoiler. I haven't read it, so I don't know how much of a spoiler it can be, but she introduces almost like an ancient aliens element to the vampire myth, which I'm not totally against, like maybe the Anunnaki are here farming gold, and, all the reptilian oligarchs are actually part of an alien race. Who knows? I love that kind of conspiracy stuff. It's going to be
the Prometheus of the Lestat mythology.
I'll have to read the book to let you know, but
you tell me.
I'll let you
go
know
first.
I'll let you know how it goes. But I'm curious, as the nation secularizes and the globe secularizes more, I'm curious whether or not that's going to show up in vampire tales,
right?
And because you do see a little bit, like in books like The Passage, it seems to be like a virus or something like that. Right. There are all these ideas that it could be an ancient race or something like that. And those are the vampire stories I've always really liked a lot.
Well, I mean, it is true. The more secular our culture becomes, the more actually horror films in general get more either totally inexplicable or there is a weird explanation. And I think that's what happened with like the 28 Days, 28 Weeks Later, where it's like, well, no, zombies, that's preposterous, but there could be a rage virus. Like that actually could happen. Like, or it goes in the opposite direction, which is the sort of like Japanese horror model, which is just like there is no explanation and you will never get one. It's just, this is just happening. And it's less reliant on some sort of evil that we can dial back to some sort of biblical mythology.
Right.
And yeah, it makes sense that vampires go the same way.
Yeah. I'd be curious. I haven't seen the sequels of this film at all, but I'd be curious, like how many generations back do these vampires go? And that's one of the interesting things I think this movie put into vampire mythology was the idea of like generational vampirism. Like there was like a progenitor vampire. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I mean, maybe it pops up in Dracula. Isn't that the whole deal where they try to save Lucy and then Van Helsing actually just kills her? And that's his whole deal. Yeah, but it plays out very differently in The Lost Boys. And that definitely gets picked up, very elaborated on in True Blood, where there's this very elaborate hierarchy and like system of government that's intertwined with family. Well, all of that stuff, in my opinion, comes from the live action role playing game Vampire the Masquerade. I mean, I think that. Were you a player? Oh fuck yeah! I played so much of that shit. Yeah, like I'm all about it, you know. And then I think that you really see the fingerprints of Lost Boys very heavy on that game. Oh, cool. You know, and I don't know if anybody's sued, but somebody from White Wolf, the company that made that game, should for sure lawyer up against the Sookie Stackhouse novels. I mean, there's just so much in those books that is an obvious ripoff of that game. I mean, the whole idea. Like how the relationship between the werewolves and the vampires comes from that game. The idea that there's this endless parade of absolutely stupid fantasy creatures to fuck. You know, like now we have elves, now we have changelings, and there's a ghost over there. All that stuff comes from the White Wolf's Vampire the Masquerade. And yeah, I mean, that game was like a big part of my life from like 15 to 17. You know, it was all I wanted to do. I'd go to Rocky Horror Picture Show, play that stupid game. Sometimes even played the game in the parking lot of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, doubling down. Oh my God. Yeah. So going back to what makes these vampires different or same, vampire mythology within The Lost Boys. Let's talk about methods of vanquishment in this film, which is, what did you think of it? This sort of like, okay, you get impaled by a stake, that's how you die. This like Deus Ex Machina almost, where Grandpa just like somehow times it with Michael to shove Max in. I don't know. Yeah, well, you know, Deus Ex Grandpa. I love that the vampires die like vampires. You know, like, I mean, I know there's the holy water might rustle some of our atheist listeners, but, you know, like Mark, for instance. Like my raised hand. Jesus Christ. Atheists are so annoying. I know. I'll be praying for you, Mark. But, you know, I like that, like, they get staked to death. And I really like the idea that they just go out all kinds of different ways. Like they might explode, they might die. You quietly. Never know. You never quite know. The Frog Brothers set that up, actually. Yeah, totally. And then you get Death by Stereo. Which is Death by Stereo. I'm actually no. Hilarious. I say no. Man, when I saw that, I thought it was hilarious. And oh God, I didn't they have a take 2 of that line? It's so forced. Okay, sorry, interrupted. Yeah, I mean, again, like this movie had such a big influence on my childhood. I remember we were dicking around, like I had a slumber party with my friends or something like that. Somebody jumped off of something and landed on my dad's like big stereo system and just smashed into it. Nothing broke, but I just remember my other buddy just stood up, threw his arms up, said "Death by Stereo," and it's just a movie line that is just cool when you're a little kid. I definitely get it. It's stupid now. But I still love it. I don't care. But yeah, the grandpa though, I mean, when I was younger, I just didn't know what to think about it. You know, I didn't pick up any of the hippie stuff. For instance, when they first go into his house and they're looking around, they look out the window of the kitchen, they see a bunch of pot plants growing and they make like the weed smoking, you know, the classic joint in the fingers motion and point at the grandpa. I didn't pick up that at all until this last time I watched it. Like I'd never noticed that at all. And I love that that kind of connects him spiritually a little bit to the stoner character in Cabin in the Woods, that perhaps it's the weed that allows him to see through the veil of illusion and see the darkness that is around him.
Yes.
Which is my experience
Which
at
is
night.
also true with Grandpa. That's great.
Yeah. And then, you know, the 60s thing, it really plays out. It's very heavy in this film. Like, for instance, when Michael transforms and he has this sort of like pseudo acid trip, his face, there's constant like fade in and out between his face and Jim Morrison's face. It happens like 6 or 7 times. And, you know, he throws on the leather jacket. He has kind of a Morrison-esque haircut. And it's definitely trying to say something like rock and roll aristocracy, cool creature of the night. But what is it saying? You know, Michael's not that interesting. He's just basically falling in with this crowd. And you get the feeling that without the grandfather, without the mother, without Sam, it's entirely possible he would have just joined this gang. Mm-hmm. You know, and or not knowing what to do, or just thrown himself under the sun or something super emo. But I don't know. I mean, does the grandpa, he leaves with these sharpened stakes in his Jeep on his date with the widow, and he comes back, and presumably because they're in the back with the points facing out, he would have had to have backed his Jeep into the house. And then, I mean, like a dude like that has as many dead animals in his house as he did, he for sure has a bow and arrow. Well, wouldn't that have been his move to just to come in and just lay waste to anything?
Yeah, no. If those huge stakes missed, he'd have had like 10 backup plans.
Yeah,
that was just his first action.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and the end,
he's just like throwing crossbows to Frog Brothers.
Yeah, and then it just goes out of control. I mean, that might even be what Lost Boys 2 and 3 and whatever there is out there. I'll never watch those movies.
My read on the Jim Morrison poster in particular is what that really signified for me was that something that this movie also brought to vampire cinema, which I think is indicative of its time. Like, you know, each episode we tend to try and draw a correlation between the films that we talk about and what do they say about that moment.
Sure.
And I think, you know, we're talking about like the tail end of the Reagan era, and there is this, the 50s were still very aestheticized, and into the 60s were aestheticized, but there was this sort of like idea of this lost youth, this lost simpler time. And I think youth and youth culture and rock and roll rebellion really signifies that. And Jim Morrison is, of course, someone who died too young to ever get old. And the thing about vampires is that they never get old. They never die. And that's always been true for vampire mythology post-Dracula. But what this movie introduced, as much as I can think about it, is the idea that it's not about you never get old and you never die. It's that you will be young forever. And it's not even, you know, some movies are about like being young and beautiful forever. But they're not talking about like teenagers, like cool, rebellious teenagers forever. And that's what Jim Morrison got to be by dying or disappearing when he was so young. And so I think it really brought in this really interesting, not only introducing that to the vampire mythology, but also there's a correlation between teen angst and the angst of being like a creature of the night. The undead. That teen movies are all about this like sort of tortured inner anger, not all the time, but there's, you know, like the I hate you mom and dad tropes of so many, like the misunderstood teen characters of Heathers. I don't know. Well, here it's totally legit. Like they're undead.
You know, it's funny too, is like that angst is almost added to Michael after the vampirism, because they seem to have a pretty decent relationship with their mom. Like they're having fun in the car, listening to the radio at the very beginning. They're switching through. There's a little bit of a generational tension choosing the music, but
no, they get along. He gets along with his younger brother. They're so tight.
And then as they, you know, as he becomes more of a vampire or like more of a teenager, in some ways, he gets more and more unbearable. You know, the whole Eternal Young thing is interesting because what we have is the first middle-aged vampire I've ever seen, which is, you know, Max. And you
he
wonder.
He had great clothes too. I should just backing up, like really weird, baggy, like he is not a cool guy.
No,
but he's totally dressed.
Yeah.
Anyway.
The other thing that's really funny about it, his character, is, you know, you're presumably this super powerful undead creature. You own your own home, but he runs a video store. You know, it's not the deep generational wealth of an ancient vampire. You know,
he's not aristocracy.
Right.
He doesn't run an antiques store or something really obvious.
Yeah.
That's what's great about this movie is all these little choices really add up.
Totally.
You know, like Grandpa does taxidermy. Why? I don't know. You know, like every character has these little, all the vampires who you don't know their names, they all have these little moments with the camera. Yeah. They all get to, you know, whether you know their name or not, they all get to be a character in even subtle ways.
One of the things that I wonder about is how long has this vampire gang been operating? You know, because they've just brought in this girl, Star. She's pretty new to the crew because she hasn't fed or turned yet. And then in some of the extra materials from the DVD outtakes, they explain that Laddie, they've turned him for her to be her buddy. So basically they've created a little doll for Star. Yeah. And then the relationship between David and Star is not explicitly sexual. You know,
no, totally.
It really isn't. I mean, he definitely like gives her the stink eye and says, "You're not getting on that dude's motorcycle. You're getting on mine." But that could be an older brother protectiveness, or it could be just any number of things. It's definitely not like a sexualized relationship.
Well, another question that I think is raised by how long have these vampires been this way, as far as like they're young and they're rebellious. Mm-hmm. Well, how long have they been young and rebellious and wearing these clothes,
right,
and riding motorcycles around the Santa Cruz boardwalk? Like, if they were still alive today, would they be like listening to Vaporwave and trolling people on Twitter? Like, what? They are so of that moment, but they're eternal. Right. But starting when and how adaptive are they?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like if I was a vampire today operating with their particular power set, I would want to go live in a war zone. You know, because they're not being cool. They're not playing music. They're not seductive. They're not trying to live a lavish life or collect vintage guitars like in Only Lovers Left Alive. There's no deeper artistic culture apparent amongst them. They're simply like savages running around this town just murdering their enemies. And, you know, there's almost like a gang beef element to it. You know, they tend to just kill people who have somehow like wronged them. You know, even if it was very minorly, like the very first kill in the film is the security guard who just told him that,
asks them not that meanly.
Yeah, just please don't fight where these children are. I mean, really not crazy, you know, like, so they go, or maybe he's asking them one too many times and they were just totally butthurt about it. But, you know, like I think a vampire like this now, I mean, you could just imagine being in like Syria or something like that and just going through and just like taking out a rebel base or something.
So having a political, like using your powers for good?
Well, not even using powers for good, just taking advantage of a chaotic situation.
I see.
So like in this film, Santa Carla has, just from the opening film, an enormous homeless youth population, which is probably why they're there, you know? And then I keep going back and forth whether or not I like Faculty of Horror's read on this film, and because they get a little bit.
Should we talk about Faculty of Horror? Should we save that for our like meta
I think we should
episode?
Talk about it because I mean, just get it out there.
Well, let me give our listeners a little history.
Sure.
Actually, like we can talk about how this podcast came to be more detail another time, but you know, we started Scary Thoughts kind of out of a conversation about Faculty of Horror, both kind of agreeing like we both listen to a lot of podcasts. We're both obsessed with horror films. Why is Faculty of Horror the only good horror film podcast?
I mean, look, there's a couple other ones, you know, that follow us on Instagram, and props to you guys. I haven't had a chance to listen to your shows, so I can't really totally speak to that, you guys. But Faculty of Horror, for all the ones I've listened to, is the only one that I keep listening to.
Yes.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just like, dude, you guys are so far off. But like, They are super smart, super prepared, like have some really interesting insights. I think they've got a good rapport. Like it's a good podcast.
Yeah, it's a great show. Her book, I can't remember which
the one on French Extremity.
Yeah, that French Extremity book is great. Like I've been like halfway through it. And then, you know, like when I mean like going back and forth, I think that their read on Lost Boys is excellent. It's just not my read on it.
I agree.
You know, and I would have never come to those conclusions that they do just because of our differences in education, probably, and the fact
and
that,
generation, maybe.
Yeah, and they're from Canada, like they're women from Canada. I'm a dude from the South, you know, the South in the United States.
I'm a dude from Canada, and I think I'm closer to your read.
Right, but you know, like. They put a lot of focus on Max being this kind of like business owner, entrepreneur, symbol of the patriarchy. And, you know, at this point in the world, you know, post video store, where they just have like one video store in San Francisco, and it's basically like it's basically a VHS reservation. You know what I mean? That it's in the middle of another business. Like, so there's like one video store. I mean, back then you probably could have maybe owned a chain of them and been very rich. But what I was thinking about was, you know, maybe Max is a little more powerful, and he is purposely and somehow influencing and repressing this town, repressing its, or rather depressing its economy in order to attract these younger freak populations so that they can feed off of. Because there's a moment where the Frog Brothers say, we think that there are ghouls and werewolves in position of high power in city government.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's just one little tiny little throwaway line, and they seem like total retards at that point in the film. But then the fact that they're completely right about the vampire thing, you sort of have to go back and think, I don't know, are there ghouls and werewolves? If so, are they here, and are they like geoengineering this town to be like this trap for the young and the lost, so that these vampires and whoever knows what else can feed on them? And I think that would be a really interesting sort of like fan book to explore, right?
Well, it does go back to True Blood a little again.
Yeah. And then, I mean, and for sure, like, I don't think I would have come to that conclusion if it hadn't been for years of playing Vampire the Masquerade, right. You know?
Right. So I have two things I wanted to kind of like get your opinion on. Is like, you know, I always have, there's always a couple of things in any damn movie that I have a hard time with, and I've sort of come to think of as Yara's e-reader from It Follows, like the thing that doesn't belong in this film. And there are so many random little things in this movie that it's hard to think of what they are, because they're just like, you know, Death by Stereo, like that just comes out of, like, love it or not, like that is just so random. So during the first sex scene between Michael and Star, suddenly we're floating through the clouds. Like that just comes out of nowhere. There is aerial cinematography that is not part of the opening montage. And I think it works. You know, it goes with the Cry Little Sister. It feels like a music video. Like suddenly you're in a music video.
And then it affirms a little bit of like the dreaminess of the film.
But the one thing that like I just can't get past is a bunch of hardcore punks are not going to be moshing around a bonfire to Walk This Way by Run DMC. That is just fucking nonsense. Like, no. The Circle Jerks concert ended, so they went and moshed to this 3-year-old song, hip hop.
Okay,
Aerosmith.
I have one thing to potentially throw a wrench in here,
and
it's the Beastie Boys, who started as a hip hop band, became a hardcore band.
No, the other way.
But started as a hardcore band, became a hip hop group, and there is a little bit of overlap. Not so much on the West Coast, but there's a little bit, you know. And then these vampires, I don't know. They look like they could be an Aerosmith, really. I mean, like, if they had scarves hanging off their motorcycles, I wouldn't be really surprised at all. Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, that really bothered me, because when I
was going to punk shows at that time,
you know,
and I was just like, I liked that song when it came out when I was in junior high, and that is not cool to me now.
Yeah,
they couldn't get a song by Social Distortion, Fear, like some punk band.
I mean, like, it's interesting choice, because that song would have for sure been more expensive than like a Black Flag song at the time, if they would even have wanted it to be in there. Yeah, I see when this film, like when I was first exposed to it, is back when like you kind of got really super into only one genre of music because you had $10 and you're not going to go try something outside of your genre because you heard it's great or it's produced by Rick Rubin or something like that. That's for now. That's for, a generation that has Spotify.
Yep.
I could definitely see now those kids like, these punk rockers listening to Wiz Khalifa or whatever, because now there's so much overlap between, hip hop and rock. You have, rappers like Yellow Wolf who look like super punks. But also fucking it up is something that blew my mind when I was a kid was when Axl Rose goes on stage with an NWA hat in one of his videos, in one of the Guns N' Roses videos. And I didn't even understand that. Like, that's how dumb I was. It just didn't compute that somebody would be into both things. But then shortly after I get into Anthrax, and then they have their crossover stuff with Public Enemy. Yep. And so I don't know. It used to bother me. It doesn't bother me at all now. So that's a very long biographical way of answering your question.
of saying like, no, Mark, you're a little off.
Yeah.
So I feel like the elephant in the room is Corey Feldman.
Yeah.
Like it would kind of be nice to not talk about that whole thing.
Are you talking about his epic performance on the Today Show?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Bill Burr has this joke.
I think we tell that joke, but I wonder if we should tell our listeners what that even is. Because we should, I just assume everybody's seen that, but maybe we shouldn't assume everybody's seen Corey Feldman's performance on the Today Show. So
pause the podcast right now. Go over to your computer, whatever device you're on, and look up
Corey Feldman
Today Show. Go for it. And he performs a song with these girls who he lives with and promotes and is maybe a cult leader, maybe not, who knows. But he has gone on the Today Show with the life that he ended up in, which is super weird. I mean, he's a child star, right? They all end up super weird. Macaulay Culkin is a millionaire in New York and just kind of post-heroin addiction has a pizza-themed Velvet Underground cover band.
Yep.
I mean, so being that famous that young, there's no way it doesn't warp you. And I'm for sure enjoying this particular warpage because it's so bizarre and
it's
so weird.
Really weird.
Yeah, and he's put himself out there. I think we mentioned on another podcast, maybe the previous one, that if I had a little more money right now, you could hire Corey Feldman to do stuff like leave you messages and things like that on your phone. And I was like, man, what would it cost to have him do an opening for our show? Not that I want to get rid of the theme music, but if you had Corey Feldman as the Frog Brother saying how awesome our podcast is. I mean, I don't have it, but at least $1,000. It'd be worth it to me,
Bill Burr.
So Bill Burr has this joke about all the older racist gentlemen, like the Duck Dynasty guy and the guy who had the NBA team, and they got put out the pasture, about how they just live too long. And I think that's the thing with these 80s child stars is they've just lived too long, man. Unlike Jim Morrison, we get to see what happens when booze and bloat and failure, which will eventually strike us all down, happens. Corey Feldman didn't get the luxury of dying before Michael Jackson touched him.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I actually found something analogous between Corey Feldman's personal history and Timmy Capello, the sexy saxophone guy.
Interesting.
Because the thing about Capello is that he was a musician, strung out on drugs, replaced drugs with bodybuilding.
That's what I did.
Right on. So, Timmy and Corey replaced their drug addictions with weirder lifestyle choices.
Yeah.
With lifestyle choices I don't know if I agree with.
Right.
Than you did. No, they both came out of addiction and just fucking went for it in these very bizarre, there is no one like Timmy Capello. That guy is ponytail, shirtless, epic chest, saxophone grinding his hips. You cannot fucking touch that. So I think you have opened up our Facebook page to some questions. Did we have a question online about Twilight?
Yes,
what was the question?
The question was just hey, can you guys talk about Twilight? Basically.
Wanting us to do an episode about Twilight?
No. Just kind of
I could do that. I've read the first book.
I read the first book on a plane.
I read it on a cruise ship.
Well, I thought, and it's made for that, right? It's
Sure.
made, and then it's so peculiar of a book. And I think I watched like half the movie or something like that. Yeah. And like what Twilight I think does is it removes a lot of the consequences of being a vampire. Like you get to see the sun, you get to hang out, and then it moves the powers of vampires. They're essentially just the X-Men. They're these weird kids that have a bunch of powers, and they fight with these other weird kids that have a bunch of powers. And I don't want to shit all over Twilight because it's pretty easy to do.
Yeah.
The chasteness of the romance and all this stuff. Everybody's had a lot of criticism about that, but what I think is missing from a lot of vampire tales is the trade-off, right? Like in Lost Boys, you have to choose between civilization and the gang, and a lot of people aren't forced to make that decision now. But they want to get like sucked up into these huge meta gangs, like Republican Democrat, something super silly like that. It's like, really, you're allied with half the people in the country because you like Huffington Post? Come on. But I think that
that was my favorite diss of any kind. I've heard it so long.
Sorry,
that's great.
I mean, and look, like if you're sore about that, like just imagine the joke with Republicans and Breitbart.
I might realize I'm sore about it later, but right now that's just funny.
But there is this kind of resurgent interest in the idea of tribes and micro affiliations and in-group, out-group, and setting yourself apart on purpose. There's these like kind of post-CrossFit groups where they take the idea of like, okay, we're tough, we work out, we know how to fight or whatever, and then they add little elements of like spiritualism. There's these dudes, very weird and interesting, Operation Werewolf. They're dudes who like lift weights, do crazy blood rituals, and kind of dress like the dudes from Lost Boys a little bit. Like they wear bones and shit all over their clothes. They look like a cross between Sons of Anarchy, the movie Hook, and like a biker gang. Sons of Anarchy is a biker, but like a crust punk gang or something like that. And then, you get the feeling that the idea of this like punkish gang of motorcycle riders has made its way into other parts of the world. Like for instance, Sons of Anarchy, right? Like that, this whole 1%er culture is very appealing to Americans, and people really got an eye of it at first, I think, through Hunter S. Thompson's Hell's Angels, So like the whole idea to me, like if somebody was like, what kind of vampire movie is Lost Boys? I would say it's a biker vampire movie, which I don't know if maybe other people would have a different opinion on that. But
that's not bad.
Yeah.
Nothing you just said has anything to do with Twilight, though.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm talking about like, right, of course not. One reason why is I can almost not bear to talk about Twilight.
Yeah.
Because I just don't know it. I just don't know it very well. And I think that, that's some kid's vampire story.
Yeah.
Like Lost Boys is my vampire story. It's like the vampire story that, I cut my fangs on. But but I don't know how much are fans affected by the film, or do fans affect the film? Or like the culture surrounding.
Like, is it more of a culture than it is an actual film? That's like, is it worth talking about as a film more than it's worth talking about as a cultural phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, even to this day, like I like motorcycles and have long hair, and I'm into weird punk stuff, and I stay up all night. I mean, is that because I love Lost Boys? I don't know, maybe like a little bit.
Probably.
Right, probably, right.
But I mean, this comes back to our conversation about the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is like, it's a film and we can talk about it as a film, but like, I dare you to talk about that movie for 15 minutes straight without referring to the culture and the mythology that surrounds it, and Twilight is similar. I think the difficult thing about Twilight is that the way that people shit on it all the time, they're right. like I think I would have a hard time having any interesting critique about Twilight that isn't actually exactly what everybody says, because I think it is garbage exactly how everybody thinks it's garbage. I think the collective disdain for that movie is pretty like, yep, that's what it is. We can maybe say good things about it in terms of like, well, if you're 12 or 14 and you need something safe and minutely edgy, like it could be a gateway to more interesting things.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said gateway, because that was the exact point I was about to make is, perhaps, Twilight serves as a gateway. I mean, look, Kristen Stewart has a black flag tattoo. Does she not deserve to have that tattoo? I can't say that. I mean, she might be a huge fan, really. But Kristen Stewart is, a huge part of that film in the way like Kiefer Sutherland is a huge Kiefer.
Well, yeah. But of course it's troubling, right? Like, we can think of Twilight as a gateway, but I think it's hard for me and probably hard for you to sort of accommodate that as a gateway when our gateways were things like harder stuff was not like, sorry to refer to the Lost Boys as hard in any way, but like, I am who I am owing to things like the Lost Boys and the Return of the Living Dead.
Yeah.
Yours was Twilight. Okay, good for you, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean,
it's a pretty soft gate.
Yeah, and then like extreme culture is so interesting now. It's like I have a buddy she's in like a black metal band, and she's part of this whole like Austin black metal scene, and it's so curious to me to just kind of follow threads of her and her friends' conversations where they'll start like calling out some band for having like Nazi sympathies or which you should, right? Like that's a shithead move. But isn't this supposed to be super evil music? Like what are we doing here? What is extremism here? Are we at a haunted house, or are we actually trying to get into some sort of dark territory with this material? I mean, what is
I think you're doing a linguistic sleight of hand. I think that like, isn't this supposed to be ... It's like, well, it's not supposed to be everything that is evil. Mm-hmm. It's not supposed to be, and let's not conflate dark with evil.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I always, I
mean, they're not disconnected.
Right.
But white supremacist black metal and white supremacist like industrial music. There's just like so much of it, and there's so the webs that those two things spin into other bands and other labels, right. And it's really extensive. And it's because once you go into really dark territory, you're going to slam up against really evil territory. And I know the word evil it's a really simplistic word to use, but like, let's be honest, like if you go to extreme music, you're always going to find white supremacy in there.
Yeah.
It's just part of it.
It's the occult element of that whole thing is very interesting to me. Of course, like Nazis were obsessed with the occult, so maybe that's where it comes from. But I mean, I remember, I had like a Current 93 patch in high school or something like that. And then, it's a Death's Head. And I remember somebody gave me a lot of shit for it. And I was like, well, it means this other thing too. And you're like, not really. And then, the groups, especially in black metal, there's this kind of like paganism, right? There's this whole return to Norseness, which is, I think, very logical, because when you're a Satanist, it's kind of back to the whole Christianity thing. Like, okay, you're into Satan, so you are immediately have bought into the Christian mythology to some extent, and that dude loses in the end. And, that's what the Book of Revelations is all about. Like, the devil loses.
Well, it depends what kind of Satanist you are.
I don't traffic in any of this.
Okay.
Like this artist statement, Satanism. I appreciate what they're doing with the statues in the courthouses and stuff like that. I think it's very interesting. But fucking sacrifice a goat or get the fuck out. That's what I'm saying. And if you have an attitude like mine, perhaps, the incursion of these fucking nerds into Satanism is what leads you into the path of like Odinism or something crazy like that. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just like where you end up. I don't know. I have no idea. For the record, I don't worship Odin.
Oh my God. Do we have anything else to say about the Lost Boys or Twilight?
I don't think I do. I mean, this is one of those movies that the theory, like the criticism, like the academic theory attached to it really seems to be, it seems to really show the politics of the person doing the reflection. And I wasn't really able to engage in stuff like that, because sometimes when something's just part of my youth and I just enjoyed it from like a super fun perspective, that sort of thing, I'm resistant to it because it sort of sullies my childhood memory of it. I don't know. Like I just, when I was watching this movie most recently, I had a head full of those articles. I had listened to the Faculty of Horrors episode, which I totally recommend you guys go in and listen to, because they do it's kind of a 2-part episode. In the first part, they do Fright Night, and I think they do a phenomenal job on Fright Night. Like I kind of disagree on, not even disagree. I just don't end up in the same place as them on Lost Boys, but I'm totally on board with their Fright Night. Mm-hmm. So I just want to like kind of make jokes and laugh and have fun when I think about Lost Boys.
It's funny you should say that, because when we agreed to do this one, I was just like, great, I'm so down to like watch that again. And when I watched it for the first time, rewatched it for the first time to do this episode, my first thought at the end was like, I have nothing to say about this movie. Mm-hmm. It's just, that was really, really fun for me to rewatch, and I don't know what to say, because it's just a little bit close. I think it would be like if we were doing an episode about Clueless or something like that. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just, how do I dismantle something I'm this close to? Yeah,
and I think, and it's interesting the way you put that, because it's not even like it's too precious for you. It's just, for me, it's just so much fun as it is. You know, it just speaks for itself. I mean, you could get...
Oh my God, did you just say it speaks for itself?
I think it does. And I'm unashamed with that position. You know, like you could go in and get super crazy about how the Frog Brothers say truth, justice, and the American way, and like what sort of like, you know, imperial values that has. But it's also what Superman says, and they're comic book nerds, you know?
Right.
And like, look, yeah, you could go down that rabbit hole where you're like, well, maybe Superman is a reflection of imperialist American value. Sure, look, you could do that till you're blue in the face. This movie's fucking awesome.
Well, I think what's implicit partly in what you're saying is that it's just fun, is sort of implying that like to critique it is to be a bummer.
Right.
And so that is something that I think in any sort of criticism is a line that I don't want to say I don't want to think of myself as a critic or include myself in like MIT press journals, but there is something about being a critic that is about taking the joy and the fun out of something, except for the reality of that you shouldn't be a critic unless you love the things that you critique.
Right. Well, this is one of the reasons why I get super high when I watch these movies. The ones I haven't seen the first time is I want to shut down my ability to engage critically in these films. I just want to experience them, you know, as it goes. And like, look, any say to no to drugs types out there, I totally get it. But it's a great way to watch horror movies.
Amazing. Let's fade to black and roll the credits.
Sure. If you made it this far, you're obviously a fan of... Sorry. If you've made it this far, you're obviously a fan of horror and perhaps in love with Marc or myself. Please don't forget... That
sort of implies that only our wives listen to this podcast.
Well, actually, the numbers would suggest otherwise. But
thankfully, thank you so... Yeah, you know what? Let's just take a minute.
Yeah.
We have a lot of listeners, and thank you guys for catching on and possibly sharing, and like we have way more listeners than I expected.
Yeah, I mean, same too. Like we have the metrics on Lisbon, and I opened it up the other day, and for sure, new episodes. Like I knew we get a bump from Peaches Christ on our last episode, super fun. But the fact that the older episodes continue to get listens is really amazing to me, and I really hope that, you know, not just for, you know, selfish reasons, but I mean, I'd love to hear from people. You know, we have a Facebook page at Scary Thoughts on Facebook. We have our Instagram page at scarythoughts.podcast, because you couldn't get both of them. God damn it. Not you. I'm not blaming you. I'm blaming the world.
I tried.
But yeah, you know, it's fun. And part of the reason why this even exists is we just love this stuff. And I know there's a lot of people out there that do. And there's a lot of smart people. You know, we had a post a couple of days ago on Facebook asking people, you know, if there's anybody we should interview as part of this. You know, there's a huge world of people who like to think of this stuff, and we're just scratching the surface, and it's very exciting to be a part of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, everybody. And we will see you next time for Gremlins.
Yeah. Ho, 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 bitches.
Thanks for listening.
please go on iTunes and give us a rating and review. That kind of bumps us up in the rate. Oh, fuck. God damn it. Okay, I'm going to start over.